I'm going to read your title because, I mean, you just can't memorize that thing.
I know. Sorry.
Don't need to apologize. It's a spectacular title.
Oh, I love it. Let it loose.
All
Let
right.
it loose.
Well, today we're honored to be joined by Amanda Silver, CVP, that's Corporate Vice President for Microsoft's Developer Division. You're the head of product design, user research, general manager of engineering systems. That's a lot.
It is. It's incredible.
What does it all mean? What does it all mean?
What does it all mean? I mean, I think at the end of the day, there's a group inside of Microsoft that's focused primarily with developers as our primary customers.
Okay.
And so when you think about what does Microsoft actually deliver to customers? Visual Studio Code, Visual Studio, .NET, TypeScript, our Azure application platform, our DevOps solutions, right? We work very, very closely with the GitHub team, do a lot of product integration across our products. So that's kind of what the gig is.
Mm-hmm. How do you feel about leading people? Is it fun for you?
I love leading people. I mean,
Yeah.
I've actually done it since fairly early in my career. I think maybe 2 or 3 years in, I started to be a manager of people. When I first started at Microsoft, I was working on the interop layer between .NET and unmanaged code. And so I kind of think about it as like I started at like the systems level, and then I started working more and more on programming language design and API design. And then from there, I got more involved in the editor experience, the debugging experience, and that's about when I started to become a manager. And, for me, I think initially it was a way for me to have more control and more influence over the product. So that was exciting. But I think over the years, I think anybody who's been in the industry long enough recognizes that like software is 90%, 95% about people. And how do you construct the team, and how do you motivate them day to day? How do you have the right balance in terms of, trying to push them to do what they may not be ready to do on their own, versus like when do you take the temperature off and let them kind of recoup from an intense period. So I find a lot of joy in the active management, and I also will say, like I've come across a lot of managers in my history that are much more like self-serving. That's their primary objective, right? And empire building, a lot of people call them. And for me, like I think it's really important that I maintain my personal integrity, and I have to check my ego a lot to make sure that, I'm not putting myself before my people.
That's tough. Sometimes, right?
I don't know. I never led quite as many teams as
No.
she's led, I'm sure. So you said empire building, and I date back all the way back to when I, as a young college student, used to refer to Microsoft as evil empire.
Yeah.
So just full confession, the
Yeah.
$$ people.
Yeah.
And over the years, I've changed. Microsoft has changed, it seems. And the embracing of open source, which has been like kind of a decade-long story, and perhaps more, has been an amazing thing to watch from the outside and like see my relationship to Microsoft change over the years. And I think you've been along for the entire ride.
Yeah, I mean that's been kind of core for my career at Microsoft in a lot of senses. And even when I started at Microsoft in 2001, let's back up for a second.
Okay, that's my college years right
when
there.
I
Okay.
started Microsoft, I had 2 older brothers who were both in the tech industry and were part of the .com bubble bust, right?
Sure.
They were each on their third job or something like that by the time I graduated from college. And so I thought when I was graduating, I thought I was going to be a scientist, and because my dad was a scientist, but I thought, if I'm going to go get a PhD or whatever, maybe I should try industry a little bit. And so I just, on a long shot, just went to the tech career fair and handed out my resume to different companies that I thought would pay me decently in cash, because I wasn't interested in stock at the time. And Microsoft seemed like a relatively stable company, and Google at the time was a startup.
Right.
And I was not going to apply.
Too risky.
Too risky.
That's funny.
So I ended up at Microsoft, and I think my first decade or so I was really focused on enterprise software, .NET primarily, right? And it was the Java, .NET, tension, and that was kind of the main primary competition that we were thinking about at the time. But open source wasn't in the vernacular.
Right.
It wasn't a thing at the time. At the same time, I think it was .NET, ASP.NET, that was the first to actually include open source in the product, jQuery. Right? Everybody had to use jQuery to be able to manage the different browser experiences. And so we first started to ship jQuery as part of ASP.NET, I guess in the 2008, 2009 kind of era. At the time, I kind of moved into the JavaScript space. I started to work on around 2009, 2010, I started to work on the Chakra JavaScript engine that was inside Internet Explorer at the time. And that was like a really big change in terms of the day-to-day competitive atmosphere that we were working in, right? Enterprise software moves much more slowly than the pace of the web at that time. And so it really changed the cadence for what we had to think about. And that's actually when we started to work on TypeScript. TypeScript, originally when we first started was really trying to answer the challenge that we had inside Microsoft, which was that we were building what we now call M365, which is like, the web experience for Excel and PowerPoint and, SharePoint and everything. But we had this challenge that we had a lot of developers inside Microsoft that had deep, deep, deep familiarity and decades of experience with C++ and C#, but they really didn't know how to build for the browser. They didn't know how to build complex applications in JavaScript. And actually, at the time, the industry didn't really either. There wasn't really...
Do we now?
We're a lot better.
We're getting there.
But a lot of the challenges were really about encapsulation and modularity and how do you create modules. And so that's where TypeScript came from. And that's when that TypeScript was really our first open source project that we did fully open source from the get-go. And I remember in that era, it took me like 6 months to convince the muckety mucks that we should.
How did you finally convince them? Like, what was the winning argument?
I think the argument was, so our objective at the time was to make sure that our internal developers didn't end up on a different path than the broad open source ecosystem that was benefiting from the evolution of JavaScript. Right?
Okay.
We had decades of experience at that point of building our own C++ compiler that kind of became really more the internal Microsoft C++ compiler and was divorced from other paths of C++ compilers that were being used more broadly in the industry. And there was a challenge in terms of trying to keep them aligned. And so over time, the internal Microsoft developers didn't get to benefit from what was happening in the broad industry on the C++ compiler. So with that experience, looking at this problem of how do we address this large-scale JavaScript solution challenge, we decided, first of all, we have to kind of stay in line with what the broad web industry is going to end up using. But then secondly, we also thought that if that was going to be the case, if we wanted to create something where we call it first party equals third party, meaning that our developers internal to Microsoft use the same tools that our third party developers use, our external developers use. If we wanted to accomplish that, then we had to build something that the JavaScript community would actually use and like. And at that time, there was still a fair amount of hostility towards Microsoft in that community.
Sure.
And so we absolutely had to launch it as open source to be able to introduce TypeScript to the world and start to get traction.
From the inside, describe the hostility. So when you
the
say
hostility from the community?
Enumerate over how hostility shows up and manifests.
Yeah, how do you see it?
From the developer community at that time.
Well, I mean, there's many different forms, right? There's some folks who would never even consider anything from Microsoft because there's just some kind of halo effect of history or something like that they would refuse to use anything from Microsoft in their stack, period. And that they won't even look at how good the technology is. Then there's kind of like the indifference or treating Microsoft products as though they are irrelevant, and they just, again, wouldn't use it or consider it because Microsoft couldn't come up with it. It's kind of a disbelief, right? Microsoft couldn't come up with anything useful. And then there's the more kind of common conversations that we have inside the industry. I think everybody has them, which is more of the debates, right? Where it's like you end up with one developer who likes the technology and can speak about the advantages of the technology, and another developer who has another argument, and they dislike the technology, and they will enumerate all of the ways that they dislike the technology. But really at the core of it, it's really some other kind of emotional thing that it's not actually on the technical merits, right?
I think in the past that was a lot clearer lines to draw because you kind of could like live entirely in Microsoft's world or live entirely in the open source or Unixy world. And now it's just much more of one world where it's like, you know, even if you are skeptical of Microsoft, like try not to use some Microsoft open source. It's gonna be used around you and probably forced upon you perhaps by your teammates or something. And at the same time, I mean, I think Azure made that change to a large degree. Between open source and Azure in the cloud, it's like, yeah, it's kind of ubiquitous at this point.
Well, that was the next thing that happened after TypeScript is, you know, we started to get a little bit of traction with TypeScript, and actually there was a fantastic partnership that we had built with the Google Angular team at the time that actually kind of got TypeScript. You know, in some senses, no programming language starts to get traction until it has frameworks, right? And so it was the Angular team at Google that we had a really close relationship with in building TypeScript in that era. And this was, again, it was 2011, 2012. There was a lot of fickleness in the web community in terms of different front-end stacks, right? It was Angular, then React, and then Vue, and so on and so forth. And but like, you know, 6 or 7 different front-end frameworks kind of made it through in those 4 or 5 years that were very, very popular. And what became fairly obvious to us was we needed to create something that was a little bit more durable that would be able to survive those different epochs of front-end frameworks. And I think over time, TypeScript kind of became that thing, which was great, and started to get more of the front-end community to use something in our stack, almost to their chagrin or reluctance or whatever.
Sure.
But I think that started to open the door. And then
VS Code kicked the door open.
And then
Am I right?
And then we introduced VS Code.
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, in a lot of senses, TypeScript and VS Code actually went really hand in hand because part of what TypeScript was doing was creating static types over JavaScript. And the tooling for JavaScript wasn't particularly good at the time because it was very hard to build great tooling for a dynamic programming language. And what TypeScript did is it created a way that we could create fantastic tooling, whether you were writing code in TypeScript or in JavaScript, it didn't matter. We could create great tooling based on the TypeScript language service in VS Code. And so the hypothesis was that if we created a great developer experience for TypeScript and JavaScript in VS Code, that every developer that's a web developer, doesn't matter what you do on the back end, everyone has to do a little bit of JavaScript. And so if we created a great developer experience for JavaScript, that would open doors, that would ultimately allow us to kind of pitch a larger tent that brought more developers into the fold and helped them to consider Azure or any of our other services.
In retrospect, it's kind of a masterstroke. You know, I'm not sure if you masterminded this or Satya did or somebody else, or if it just happened kind of organically over time as things tend to do, where it's like these dominoes just lined up and really did, change the brand and the developer relationship to Microsoft over time.
Well, I mean, I will say, like, you know, certainly while I was present and helping and you know, involved in shaping the strategy. Like there's definitely cannot take credit for the overall direction and
Sure.
like, whether it was Anders Heilsberg helping shepherd TypeScript to come to the fore, or Eric Gamma and team kind of building VS Code, just incredible people that I've gotten to work with over the years.
So now you have VS Code and TypeScript
Yeah.
and GitHub.
Yeah. Well, that was a little bit later.
Yeah, a little bit later. Maybe I'm jumping ahead, but I'm
Yeah.
trying to get to the present day because here we are in Build 2025.
That's right.
And, I was counting the mentions of agentic in the keynote this morning because I'm a nerd like that.
Yeah.
And I got to 187.
Okay, yeah.
Whew.
Yeah, I even left off like things like model or MCP, or I left Copilot off, which is like,
Wow.
because I feel like you're just going to get to 1,000. I can't count that fast.
Well, you could always take a transcript, give it to an AI, and it can count it for
That's
you.
true. But I wanted
Yeah.
to do it live.
I thought about that too.
I was
I was like, yeah,
I thought about it as
it'll
well.
be easier later.
I thought about it as well, but you
Or
got
word calculator.
We're gonna keep the mind going as well. VS Code, I don't want to call it a Trojan horse because it has negative connotations, but it's kind of this thing that you've gotten out there now as an open source project and as a product that, how many millions of people use it, right? You probably know.
We have
rough numbers.
We have 50 million monthly active users.
50
50
million.
across VS Code and Visual Studio together.
Okay,
right.
across the
And
two of them.
so yeah.
And which
so
one's bigger?
VS Code
VS Code's bigger.
significantly.
So you have both arms of that. You have like the
Yeah.
IDE people in Visual Studio, and then you have the text editor people in VS Code. And through those platforms, you can launch all this other stuff, right? Like all this Copilot stuff. Is that how
Yeah,
you look
I
at it,
think-
or is that just how I look at it?
I think that we can kind of bootstrap a lot of developers to get more familiar with Copilot for sure, and I think that in a lot of senses, like the code editing experience, it really like the table stakes have changed, right? You have to have AI as part of the code editing experience. So I don't know if it's as much as us going and like forcing it on everyone as much as it is this is what is now expected of a modern code editor.
Right.
And I don't mean forcing it. I just
Yeah.
think that you have this platform in which you can launch other stuff, and Copilot really has had a great opportunity there,
Right.
to just be like, bam, right there.
That's
You're
true.
already using VS Code.
I mean,
It works great in VS Code. Click the button, bam.
I think that in a lot of senses, like, Microsoft has always been a developer first company, like since the, MS-DOS basic days. Like that's been where, Bill Gates' heart was at. And I think that, as it moved through Ballmer to Satya, like we've consistently had great sponsorship for our developer tools and platforms throughout history, right? And I think that the reason for that is because at the core, the CEOs and Microsoft always thinks about its reason to exist as a platform company, right? We are building a platform that other people build incredible things on top of. And to do that, you have to have developers as your focus. And so I think of like the work that we do in the developer division as it is a platform to bootstrap new things, new platforms, new adoption of new tools, new workflows, no question. But at the same time, like there's lots of things that we've tried to launch in that way, and it didn't take
So
off.
it helps, but
Yeah.
it's not like a cure-all.
Yeah, exactly.
Still got to be good.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's telling though that it happened with VS Code though, right? Like it's 50 million developers across two different editors, combining them, I guess that way. And that's a lot of developers. You have a captive audience. I think that's what he's alluding to. Is like you have a captive audience to say, okay, as you launch new things or even breakthrough, like Copilot, for example, that you have a lot of developers that already have attention, and it's not that much harder to launch. It's distribution for an idea.
Right.
I would say actually that developers are one of the most empowered audiences across all of the audiences that we target, right? That they vote with their feet more than any other audience that exists, whether it's consumer, enterprise, et cetera, right? Enterprise, totally different way that they drive decision making. Developers, it's an end user consumer audience that basically chooses things based on what's working for them, right? And we see all the time developers picking up new coding editors, picking up new frameworks. they're technology enthusiasts, right? That's actually one of the things that makes the job so rewarding is I can launch something at the beginning of the day, and by the end of the day, I know if it was a hit or a dud because I have so many early adopters that are kicking the tires, right? And I think that we don't have a captive audience at all with our developer tools. I think that developers have a tremendous amount of agency, and that the way that we think about it is we have to win their loyalty every day with actual great product experiences.
So this reminds me of a post I actually put in Changelog News today. I think Avdi Grimm wrote this called "Developer Tooling is a Lousy Business," and he actually enumerated some of the points that you're making. You're saying it's great for us as developers, right? Because we have the agency we speak of, and we're really, I guess, adept at handling our tools and changing our tools, and that makes us somewhat of a fickle audience because what have you done for me lately?
That's right.
And so. In that sense, I guess, how is Copilot changing? Because I remember when it first came out and it was autocomplete and it kind of was game-changing in that way, but it was really a non-deterministic autocomplete. That was good, but had its problems, and has grown since then. You guys continue to iterate, make it more and more awesome. And this year, you're announcing a lot of it being a coding agent. Can you tell us all about it?
Yeah. Well, so, in a lot of senses, Copilot has gone through the same epochs that AI itself has gone through, right? Over the past couple of years, like the AI basically got to the point where it was good at doing token prediction and things like that. But then over the last couple of years, it was we introduced chat, and that allowed you to have a conversation with a knowledge base based on retrieval augmented generation. And then, just over this past year, it started to get to the phase where it could actually start to take actions because the models themselves got to the state where they could actually reason over what they were working on. And so for Copilot, we started with completions, and the completions at first were just a single line of code, and then they got to full function bodies, and then they got to longer, maybe a whole file, and then last year we introduced multi-file edits, right, so that you could actually make multiple changes to your code base at once based on a basic prompt. We introduced chat capabilities, which could be based in the context of the project or the source code that you're already working in the repo. And that kind of started to change the game. But I would say nothing has accelerated the capabilities as quickly as what we introduced with agent mode this past February. And then it's kind of rolled out over the past few months. But agent mode, it is shocking what you can accomplish in just a really short amount of time, just letting it go. Basically what you do with that, and it's also had its own acceleration, but what you do with agent mode is you go into the prompt, into the Copilot chat experience, and you switch it to agent mode, pick a model, whether you want, Sonnet 3.7 or you want, GPT-4o or whatever you want to use, and then you give it a prompt like add tests for this particular project, and it will then iterate and self-evaluate as it's iterating. So, for example, in my demo earlier today, all I did was I gave it source code repo for a website. And I said, test this solution and write some integration tests for me. And it basically started to do all of the automation to bring up the Playwright automation framework, bring up the website, start to traverse all of the different paths that it could go through in terms of the various different customer journeys on the website. And then it started to generate the tests themselves, right? And so what used to take me hours, maybe a half day, I can now get done in just a couple of minutes using agent mode. And so I think that's really like changing the equation in terms of what these tools are capable of.
Yeah, it's really ramping up the potential gains. One thing that I fear with that is the more you change, the harder it is to find the thing that went wrong. It's like the needle in the haystack problem, where if it's an autocomplete of a single line, cool, I can just see what it says. If it's a function, I can kind of read through that real quick or maybe go in and make changes. If it's a file, okay, now it's getting big. But as it's like multi-file changes with all of this stuff going on, and like it's been thinking for 4 minutes and I'm not sure what it was thinking. It'll tell me if I want to look at it. But, here's this big change we're going to make.
Change log.
Exactly. And now I got my code review step, basically. And there's so many things there that I just get a little bit apprehensive of, like, am I going to be able to find potentially where that one needle is in the haystack that maybe make the whole thing go haywire? Are there guards? Are there helps? Are there concerns that might be an issue?
I think that's something, first of all, that we need to think about in the design of the tool itself, right? We need to make sure that we are not introducing something that creates so much cognitive load for you to ingest in terms of change management that like it's beyond your ability to reason over, right? So we are very intentional in terms of like how we guide the prompts.
Break it down.
To kind of control just how much code is actually going to be generated. Other reasons that we do that as well. But I think the other thing is, we really want to make sure that we are working with the workflow that you're used to, right? So another thing that we introduced today is the coding agent, where, if you think about agent mode in VS Code as the experience that allows you to give it a prompt and then you can do synchronous supervision over how it's completing all of the tasks in that prompt. The coding agent is asynchronous. And so you can almost think about it as agent mode is your peer programmer. It's looking over your shoulder. It's accelerating your capabilities. But the coding agent is your peer programmer, where you can assign tasks to it as though it was another member of the team. And so it's just like in GitHub. If you're assigning an issue to your colleague, you would instead assign it to Copilot, and it can asynchronously go and execute that task and figure out come up with a plan and go and create a pull request and complete that task for you, right? And so what that, I think, enables is for you to then still think about the tasks that you're assigning to the agent in the same granularity that you would assigning it to another developer on your team.
Right.
So you could theoretically do a multi-file edit, like build something, prompt it for that, and then run an agent against that and say, debug this, make sure it's sound code.
Correct.
So versus, like your question was the fear of the code sucking, basically.
Right. I got my code review agent. I got my coding agent.
Well,
my
don't
code
worry,
review
because
agent.
at the end you can just unleash your agent and just say, agent,
That's
check
right.
that.
I mean, you could certainly have parallel, adversarial agents kind of working against each other. You could set up that kind of system where, you basically start to build your code. You then want to say, okay, I'm going to have one agent that's going to be focused on, the readability and maintainability of this code, and another agent that's going to be focused on maybe the performance and optimization of the code. And, you could have both of those things kind of going at the same time based on, really, at the end of the day, in a sense, you kind of can create these things by virtue of just providing the prompt. You just say, oh, here, Copilot, I have a new issue. I want to optimize the performance for this particular page.
Right.
It's actually going to do it.
It's actually going to do it.
It's going to do it.
I just think of these like little functions you can call, check this, check that, write tests here, confirm, like.
That's right.
That's really wild, and they do it.
Yeah, and we also have obviously pull request reviews as a part of Copilot as well. So, we also apply it at that kind of large scale for basically every code change in that we make inside of Microsoft or in our open source repos as well. We do kind of AI based code reviews.
Right. I know you're using the classical data science form of adversarial there, but I kind of had a moment where I was like, it would be fun to just pit these agents against each other.
I was too.
Listen, okay, this agent's not very good at their job, and they always get things wrong. Now your job is to watch them, keep an eye on this.
He's known to hallucinate.
You don't like them very much,
I was thinking that too. Like, could they either, when will they get upset, and will they compete? Can you compete them? You both have the same job. The one who does it better gets the task. They define their job is to do the task and be excited about getting it right.
And then you'll give
so they compete with the person or the other.
Well, I mean, I think that actually there's something to that, and I think one of the things that for folks who are working on different machine learning models for the application to coding, we have benchmarks. Right, just like in the old days when I was working on the JavaScript engine, we had performance benchmarks that we had to work on. Nowadays, we have benchmarks for these SWE agent kinds of models that are coming out. And so part of what there's different kinds of techniques that you go through in terms of kind of getting the performance of the benchmark to be better, because you can optimize for different things. You can optimize for token consumption. So like, what's the cheapest way to accomplish it? You could optimize for performance. How can I complete the job more quickly? You could optimize for accuracy, right? And so like, in a lot of senses, what you're saying is actually not wrong. And I do think that over time, when we think about different competing agents that could actually go and fulfill your job, you could have ones that are experts in different types of tasks.
Fascinating potential world. You mentioned every line of code, or a lot of the codes that we do here at Microsoft. That got me thinking about your own products.
Yeah.
And Satya mentioned code modernization. Of course,
Yeah.
a huge opportunity, right, for these agents to do. I was just thinking about Anders and the team's port over to Go.
Yeah.
And how tedious that could be unless you have some agents doing the work for you. I'm curious about your old software projects. I'm thinking Visual Studio is pretty old at this point.
Yeah, we have 20-year code bases, 25-year code
Are
bases.
you harnessing these things to modernize things like Visual Studio?
Can I say I'm glad you asked?
You can say that, sure.
Well, actually, one of the things that we introduced today is allowing GitHub Copilot to help you modernize your .NET and Java code. So if you have a dependency on like, .NET 6 and you need to move to .NET 9, or, you have a dependency on Java 8 and you need to move to Java 21, then you can actually use GitHub Copilot to help you do that. And this is like a big deal because, it used to be that those kinds of jobs, like,
the worst.
That's the thankless job that as a developer, you hate.
Didn't somebody
that.
spend like 10 years doing that stuff?
Yeah,
What was that
course.
thing? We just read the story.
Yeah.
That moment when like your boss comes in and it's like, we need to modernize the code base and I need you to work for 6 months on doing this port. Like,
Right.
Oh my God, that's crushing, right? Because you don't get to do anything that's like exciting.
Yeah, it's just tedious.
It's kind of tedious. And, from our customers who are using it, they're telling us it takes care of 70% of the code migration. So at least. So that's pretty incredible. We have like success rates of like in the 90s of just upgrading your code base. So I think that's one dimension of technical debt that this kind of stuff can take care of. Another is like security vulnerabilities, right? And that we're applying this internally at Microsoft very, very broadly. You can basically go look for CVEs, and once the CVEs are found, then we can actually go and file a PR to get it automatically fixed, and then all you have to do is review the code change. So, like, my hope, I think that the industry is still saddled with like incredible amounts of technical debt, and if we can actually go and erase a bunch of that technical debt, like just imagine how much more innovation could happen.
I got to thinking about this idea of like the state of human velocity. Like we are now doing things that we would normally do, not because we can't do them, because they're just so time consuming.
Yeah.
Like porting a code base to something else. Like we were spending a decade to do something like that. And now I think we have access to a tool that lets us think bigger, not because it does the work, but because we can get past the hard things easier and sooner. So the speed of humanity essentially it's kind of like maybe the inflection point of speed for humanity, because like we've been going pretty slow.
Yeah.
And like since the 1900s, you got cars and industry change, and at the end of the 1900s, you have the explosion of computers and the internet, and then the 2000s, it's social media and all the things, and now it's like AI is here to help us all go to a new plateau faster.
Yeah. I mean, I think in a lot of senses, like we've been I wouldn't say struggling, I would say limited by the available developer talent in the world. We still have like a shortage of developers, in my opinion, right? A significant shortage of developers across the world, and especially developers who have higher level systems thinking and reasoning capabilities, right? And so I think that in a lot of senses, like what this all represents is an opportunity to kind of spread that knowledge a bit more broadly. And like think about all of the apps that, your organizations wanted you to write, but you never got to because your backlog was so long, right?
Right.
I think there's huge amounts of demand and need in the industry overall that is just not getting addressed today because developers are saddled with like technical debt, and what they already have on their plate is significant enough to occupy them, right? And so if we can actually erase a bunch of that, I think that's going to make a huge difference overall. But I think the other thing that's super important in all of this is there are aspects of the developer job that are not awesome, right? Technical debt being one of them. Another thankless task is like being on call and responding to live site incidents, right, in the middle of the night. I know that a lot of our developers do not relish that aspect of their job, right? And I think that a lot of the new capabilities in AI like allow us to offload at least the less complex cases of site reliability engineering response to agents. So one of the things that we talked about today is we introduced a new site reliability engineer SRE agent that can actually deal with, like, if my app suddenly starts to be unhealthy, it can actually go and do a profile and understand if it's, a memory issue, and even start to auto scale your infrastructure to be able to respond and mitigate the issue. It may not be the permanent right repair item or fix. That might come a little bit later, but it can do that first line of response. And for us inside Microsoft, we've actually been applying it internally significantly, and have dealt with a ton of, like, hundreds. I think we're probably at thousands now of incidents that have been managed in this way, such that developers never needed to get involved, and and then they just review the repair items from the recommendations from this autonomous SRE agent. So I think that's pretty cool, because there's aspects of the developer job that's all about, like, creation. You love that moment when you get to write new code, you get to scaffold out like new, I always loved like scaffolding out new like class libraries and frameworks, and like just doing like the first rough-in of the application. That was always my favorite part, right? But like this means that developers they don't have to get woken up in the middle of the night, and their job doesn't have to be awful.
It's like self-healing, and I imagine that, like you said, the fix may not be a permanent one. It's more focused on uptime.
Yeah, exactly.
My goal is this autonomous agent is not the best long-term fix. It's keeping the application up.
So, yeah, I mean, SRE agents, SREs in general, are always focused on application uptime and, like, mean time to mitigation, right? So, like, if there is an incident, how long does it take for them to actually respond to it? And then, they also are concerned about things like costs and operations over time. And, I think they can much more meaningfully contribute to how to build healthy, large-scale systems that operate well.
So are these agents actually applying the fixes, and the person doesn't have to come in and hit that button that says, yeah, let's go ahead and do this? Did I hear that right?
Correct. Yeah. I mean, it's all within policy, right? So you can decide like what limits you want it to have, but if you need to scale your infrastructure up to be able to handle more memory, for example, it could deal with that automatically in the middle of the night without having to ping you and wake you up. And then you come in the morning and it says, hey, we had this incident. We had this out of memory exception that happened here, and then you can go investigate it in the morning and go figure out what's the long-term fix.
You could almost have it do the fix and another agent check the fix.
That's right.
You know what I mean? Like
That's
your
right.
policy, you alluded to the policy. The policy essentially is an augmentation of potentially an agent that has different parameters.
You're trying to take us out of the job, aren't you?
I mean, I'm just saying that's where it's going.
I don't think any of this is I said,
necessarily, but like that's what you can do though. So you can have somebody that's the thing all the time. You can have an agent that just checks it to confirm based on policy. Within these bounds, you have agency to do this thing.
Correct. Yeah.
Without of those bounds, it is a no.
Yeah. I think that's a lot. When we talk about like what are the skill sets that developers are going to need to have for the future, it's still the same complex systems reasoning, right? When you think about if I have multiple policies that I am applying to how to manage infrastructure during a live site incident, right? That in and of itself, that set of policy rules, that is a complex system. And you have to think through, well, what happens when this role conflicts with that role? How is the system going to respond? So I think that's where a lot of our brain time is going to start going, is thinking about how these different kinds of systems and agents that are somewhat autonomous are going to interact.
Right.
Are you thinking about how these agents manifest as a visible layer to this agentic internet and web that was alluded to? Because I'm thinking
I love that.
there's this idea of agents available, and so why recreate the wheel? I was really just thinking about the idea of a secret agent. And
Why were you doing that, Adam?
I was just like, that's a really cool name for an agent that doles out secrets, maybe, or just deals with
Sure.
authentication and authorization kind of thing.
Yeah.
If there was an agent,
Yeah.
there was a secret agent,
That's cute.
and I would want to discover that secret agent.
That's cute. Okay.
Anyways,
Well, a couple things I would say about that. First of all, yes, I think in terms of thinking about the common way that you can go interact with all of these different agents, yes, I do think that ultimately our goal is that GitHub Copilot can become that common substrate. It's almost like the omnipresent agentic command center that allows you to interface with, no matter if you're talking about your infrastructure or your code or your test or even, tasks that I have to do to go work through the bureaucratic layers of our ops team or whatever it is. I think a lot of that can start to become interfaced through working with GitHub Copilot. So yes, on that point, I think what you're bringing up around secrets is a great question, right?
sure. I was just wanting to call it secret
No,
agent.
no, but here's
Still
the
a great
thing.
question, though.
Here's the thing, though. Here's the thing. Inside Microsoft, I've kind of 2 jobs at Microsoft. One is I'm head of product for our developer division, and the other job is I'm basically the GM for our platform engineering team. And so that means that basically we build all of the tools and all of the policies for all of the internal engineering teams at Microsoft. So we kind of take all of our third-party products and we host them and administer them and extend them and incubate in them for our first-party engineers. One of the big things that we've been trying to focus on is expunging secrets from our code bases, because secrets are dangerous,
Very
right?
dangerous.
And if you have them in your code bases, then if you have malicious actors, they can go in and try to exfiltrate your code and get your secrets and then get access to your infrastructure. So generally, we are trying to move towards a system where we do not have secrets checked into our code bases. That said, that's a great application of the kind of policy that can be applied at your organizational level to say, look, if I have any code that looks like a secret, I want you to flag it. I want you to file an issue because I want that to be manually checked. And we also have in GitHub Advanced Security detection of those kinds of secrets as well, so that we can actually make sure that you never push it into your code base.
Well, then I propose that you make that a product. And
secret
you call
agent?
it
Done, sir.
And you call it secret agent, and you credit Adam Stacoviak as
right.
the idea
Just
for
in the
for
fine
name.
print at the bottom.
I just like that. It's so cool to have that. Make that a thing.
Make that a thing. Now you have 3 jobs at Microsoft.
Yeah,
the third
I'm
one's to
working-
get that thing named
I'm
Secret
working
Agent.
on Secret Agent. Secret Agent.
It's catchy.
I think it's called GitHub Advanced Security.
Okay.
Oh, there you go. Less. I mean, it's a
AKA.
cool name. But it's a cool name, but it's not a brand. Secret agent.
Yeah, if you whisper it, it sounds even cooler.
That's right.
Oh my. So, do you think about cascading effects? Especially, I'm just back on the SRE side of things, and thinking about turning over so much to
Control.
to software agents, which again are, what did Nathan Sobel call it? A
Genius golden retriever on acid.
Yes. Which maybe those are the models he's working with. But, a thing that you don't ultimately know what it's going to do. Now,
Yeah.
you can train and fine-tune and guard and watching agents all you want. However, we've seen at scale, the internet operating, distributed systems at scale, things go wrong in ways that are sometimes very quick, very catastrophic,
Yep.
and compounding and cascading. One thing that I think about is, some of these stock market trades when you have quick corrections or crashes is because you have software making margin calls and trading with software programs, and and eventually what happens is, the New York Stock Exchange actually just stops everything and is like, let's chill out here.
Yeah.
And I think there's a potential of that kind of thing with agent SREs, changing the memory on your VM, and then this happens.
Like a
and
race
that's-
condition amongst agents or something like that.
Just,
you know?
and
That
I'm
could
wondering,
happen.
like, what kind of, I know you all think about security a lot, and what kind of stuff is out there for just making sure that maybe there's a pull the plug moment or a way that you can get back in the loop and say, okay, let's just chill out here, guys.
That's a fantastic question.
Call them guys.
Well, just a team,
So
team.
I think generally what our approach is that we want to make sure that every agentic workflow is completely auditable, so that we can see what the agent is actually executing, look over it in history, that we do have controls over it to be able to say these are the resources that you have access to. And we also have to think about things like ways of testing the models themselves, whether it's a model that we build or it's a model that you build and for your software. And that's part of what we build with the AI Foundry that allows you to actually evaluate the models against all different kinds of checks. Whether that's, safety and security checks, whether that's responsible AI kinds of harassment kinds of scenarios, or language that's inappropriate. A lot of that is really what has to get built as a part of kind of building and evaluating models themselves. And then we also want to have this common agentic control layer across all of the software that uses agents, so that we can see what those agents are actually actively doing, what resources they have access to, and restrict what they have access to if they start to go astray.
Right.
And we'll be showing a demo of that tomorrow.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really just a big orchestration problem at the end of the day, and then underneath it you have your, what do you guys call them? Not the frontier, but the foundry.
Foundry.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
models themselves, and I think it's
Yeah.
really cool how much choice is available at the model level, because I've even in my personal use and in my coding use have appreciated the ability just to swap these different ones, especially as they leapfrog each other in capabilities.
Yeah.
And I think it's really cool how many different models are
Yeah.
available.
I mean, that's one of the things that I think has been really great about kind of bringing GitHub models into AI, or bringing the AI Foundry model catalog into GitHub models, is it allows developers to be able to go kick the tires on all the different models that are out there. And, they all have different kind of strengths and weaknesses. And, in some senses, I think about it as a search space of like different model characteristics that, have a certain price and a certain performance. And you just need to kind of go find what's the right one for your particular use case. And I think that the fact that we've integrated GitHub models, AI Foundry model catalog into GitHub models really does allow developers right in GitHub to go test these different models in a playground. And then further, because we have in VS Code the ability to select models as a part of your chat experience, we also find a lot of developers using that chat experience as a way to go test which model is meeting their particular needs for their use case, that they then go right into the application that they're building.
That's awesome. No further questions. I don't have anything to question about that. I just think it's cool.
Yeah.
And I like, and you're not the only ones doing that. A lot of people are, and I think it's great. I love just giving developers choice.
Yeah.
Versus saying, no, you're going to use this. It's the best one. Trust
Always.
us. It's
Always.
like, no, don't
Yeah.
do that to me. That being said, which one's the best one?
Well, I'm waiting for .agent to become a
Okay.
TLD.
Oh,
Oh, yeah.
that'd be a
right?
good one.
I mean, AI is cool, but
.agent.
Because then you
Especially
have
as
secret
Dot
.agent.
agent. Yeah.
that's all for
I
this one
think
thing.
Domain registered.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That would be a
Yeah.
good TLD, because I think there's going to be, they're going to be selling agents like you're selling apps at this point, don't you think? I mean,
Well,
Fair. Yeah.
If there's a company well positioned to sponsor in some way, shape, or form, because we just learned about DNS with Anthony Eden and how TLDs come into play.
Right. You got lots of money to host
know,
a TLD.
Yeah, there is a
agent.
whole namespace question, right? How do you
Yes.
find all these different agents?
Right.
How do you figure out which one you want to deploy for this particular problem? And I think that's one of the big next things.
Yeah.
Both agents and tools. There's going to be just like there's a catalog for models. There's going to be catalogs for agents and for tools.
And the best way to catalog them is .agent. It really is. I mean, if you're building the agentic web, this open agentic web that's happening, .agent.
Okay,
He's
I'll
a
take it.
salesman.
I'll
There's
take it to the top.
Two more
Take it
missions.
to
You don't,
the top.
if you don't mind.
All right.
And just come back to me for
All right.
Just for
any
the
any
asterisk.
final sign off on these ideas and
Okay,
stuff.
love it.
I can give you more.
Love it. Love it.
So the advancements every year are interesting. It's moving very fast. Here we are, 25. If it were up to you, 26, the three of us sit down. You don't have to unveil any secret roadmaps or anything, but like what would be going on next year this time if you were excited about it? What would be the next step? We're at agents. Where are we next year?
Well, first of all, I think the agents we've seen with agents just how powerful they are, and so we've seen a lot of promise. I think there's also a lot of peril in there as well.
Yes.
And what's going to start happening is that basically a lot of folks are using them without real security controls. And so I think we're going to need to see more ways, to your point earlier, around how do I audit and control all of these agents working throughout my enterprise or my team. So I think that's one thing.
Sure.
We're going to start seeing a lot more controls in that sense. The other thing is part of what we're seeing, and this is really only accelerated over the last 3-4 months as we've started to have capabilities like agent mode and VS Code, is the capabilities of the software development team are also changing, right? Developers now can do better designs. They can make things not just prettier, but more easily usable without having to have designers involved. Designers can code. Product managers can now code. So what does that mean for how we think about the evolution of the software development team, and what canvases do we think we need to do collaboration?
I think of it like giving somebody who, the whole team or the whole group of people you just mentioned, they all speak a language. Let's just say it's English, for
Okay.
just lack of better terms for this analogy. I think of it like these folks have a limited vocabulary. These folks have a limited vocabulary, and they're all specialized. And now they have a more shared language spectrum because
Exactly.
you have the words, we have the words, we can share the words. That's called speaking, of course, as
Yeah.
you know. But I feel like that's what it does. Is like you now give them, they all spoke English already because they all understood some of the code, some of the design, some of these different features, but now they can all speak a certain language.
I completely agree
You know
with
what I
you.
mean?
But I think that part of what's going to happen is that everyone is going to start contributing to the code base more easily, right? And
Which is better for the product. I mean,
I
and
think
the
so
user,
too. I think
obviously.
so too. But I think we're already starting to see designers contribute code, right? In terms of like, rather than handing a design over the wall and say, engineer, go implement it. No, the designer can actually go, and if they want rounded corners, they can get rounded corners to happen, right? Or if a PM has an idea around a new feature that they want to experiment with, maybe they can go build an initial prototype with that without having to go bother the engineers to go get that done, right? And I think that starts to kind of raise interesting questions around how do you think about architecting different kinds of systems. I think, maybe one of the things that might happen is that there's a difference between solutions that are more sitting at that SaaS level versus services that are more at the systems level, right? I think that SaaS level is going to start to be something that is more easily extended. Today, when we think about something like a Microsoft Office or M365, or we think about something like GitHub itself, it's essentially a end user experience, a SaaS, that is being provided, and it has extensibility points. And those extensibility points are painstakingly crafted, because every time that you expose a new API that allows you to customize the environment,
Right.
it both empowers your users to go build other things, but it also represents kind of a boat anchor that like you're stuck with
It's
the
a
back
contract.
compatibility for
Yeah.
that contract, right? But I think that what this is now kind of enabling is for you to start to build other systems, other automation on top of other systems much more easily, even without the API, to be frank, because now it can just like traverse the DOM or whatever it needs to do. And I think that means that like a lot more software becomes a lot more extensible. And I think that that means also that the way that you build software itself is going to end up changing over time. The other thing that I think is super interesting is like we also spend a huge amount of time right now on the view, creating the view,
Sure.
right? Like if in an MVC kind of model,
Yeah, totally.
right? I think in the future, like it might just be that you focus on the model, and the view you actually go and specify with a design system.
Well, I saw a T-shirt downstairs. It had a bunch of things crossed off. I think developer was one of them, and something else. And it just said builder.
Yeah.
And so I feel like y'all been ahead of the times, basically. With I think people are becoming builders rather than just developer or just designer, and the word "just" not pejoratively, if that's even a way to say it, but more so builder. Everybody's a builder, and everybody can contribute.
Yeah, love it.
I have a question that I think is maybe would have been way better back in the VS Code part, but as we wrap
Spicy.
up, I don't know if it's spicy or not, but I'm curious. We were kind of debating, VS Code's foothold and is it a strategic advantage and this and that, and the open sourcing of that and what it's been for a good thing for Microsoft. What we've seen recently in the vibe coding space is VS Code forks, and these forks come up fast and furious. And they're getting huge valuations.
Sell for billions.
Right, they sell for billions. They're getting large user bases very quickly, at least it seems like they are. And in a sense, that's a little bit of a backfire, right? Because now you're providing VS Code, this platform, which is just forkable. And now you're like giving competitors an opportunity to just catch up real quick and compete with Copilot in weeks. I mean, they could vibe code their way to a $3 billion valuation. Does that bother you? Do you even see it? Are these just like the cockroaches that you just get out of here, cockroach? Or how do you guys view it? How do you?
No, I mean, I
Kelsey
think
Hightower that one. I love you, Kelsey.
I think that there's real innovation that's happening in the industry and a level of competition that we haven't seen for a long time. So
Yes.
like I have a tremendous amount of respect for the competition that we're seeing right now in the code editing space. I will say, like, yes, I think that there is a lot that has been built on top of the open source code base of VS Code, and I think that is creating a foothold that allows others to kind of go and create additional, features or differentiation on top of it. But that's I think one of the reasons why we've decided to actually open source the GitHub Copilot extension for VS Code and build it directly into the VS Code code base is, we really do think that the AI experience is now table stakes for any code editor. And in the same way that VS Code has been open from the get-go, we think that now the AI capabilities in VS Code also need to be part of the open source code base. And I think that, we certainly believe in, whether it's VS Code or TypeScript or, anything that we do in like the Azure SDKs or .NET, like all of that's open source. So like half of what my team works on is done in the open source. We certainly see that especially when you're trying to build a community around a technology, an ecosystem around the technology, building in the open actually creates better products. It allows more people to contribute, whether they're contributing pull requests and code contributions, or if they're just logging issues and just, they care enough to actually follow through with really great issue descriptions. That's an important way to contribute to the code base. And we see that across all of our open source code bases. And I think what we hope to see now is there's a tremendous amount of innovation that's been happening in AI-based coding. What we hope to see is more of the community contributing back to the VS code base to really advance the state of the art for everybody.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I would call them competitors, though.
You don't think Windsurf is a competitor of Copilot?
I would say...
I'm going to use one or the other, aren't I?
No, I guess but is that your customer, for lack of better terms? Is that the...
Oh, they want all the customers, don't you?
I don't think so. I think...
Let her answer.
Well, this is what I assumed you were thinking, and you said a lot of things, but you didn't say this. But if I read between the lines, and I think if I were you, I wouldn't see as competitors because you are focused on developers using VS Code, and I don't think they're not developers. But if you're vibe coding, it's not a developer action. It's a different way to get the end result.
Yeah.
Right. A developer writes code and cares about the code, whereas the other way is not so much less about the code. It's a different way to get there. That's how I look at it.
So I think there's kind of two pivots to that. First of all, I would say I think that code editors, generally, if your primary task is to write code, then I would say any of the popular code editors are competitors in a sense.
Right.
But to the point earlier that we were talking about, we believe that we live or die by day-to-day product truth.
Yeah.
And we have to basically win every developer based on their usage and experience with our products. And we strive to make the best products we possibly can. I think to your point around vibe coding and how does that relate, I see vibe coding as a really interesting evolution, right? It's not quite...
I'm throwing 0 stones at that. I'm agnostic when it comes to all innovation. Whatever gets us to the next place, we all love it. That's what I'm for, right? And if vibe coding is one of the ways we get there, or it invites more people in to build software, cool.
I think vibe coding invites a lot of people in to go build more software. I think that it's not your typical pro dev software developer, but I think that what vibe coding has kind of started to create is more of this pattern of what I would call natural language driven development, which is starts with maybe a vibe initial prompt, but then it evolves into
something
a
really
full
good
spec.
Yeah.
And the spec is still written in natural language. It's not written in C# or TypeScript or JavaScript or anything like that. It's written in a natural language, English in my case, but could be written in whatever. But then you take that spec and then you use that spec as the prompt. Right. And that allows you to then iterate to this level that you can get to a much more sophisticated first implementation of the code that you're aiming to implement. And then you continue to iterate, and you may even modify the spec as opposed to modifying the code. Right. And so I think that's starting to change things. And so, from there, then it's okay, well, now the PM can contribute even a spec, right, for a feature, or they could contribute a spec for the initial product. The active testing could also be, in some senses, a large prompt, right? The designer could contribute a design system into the code base.
Right.
And so I think what we start to see is that over time, the code base is not just everything that builds. It's all of the prompts for all of the systems and all of the different, phases that you go through of the software development lifecycle.
I think that's really insightful. And one of the things that I've noticed as an experienced developer trying to adapt and adopt the tools is that software isn't built in a chat scenario. You don't chat your way to a software system because there's just so much chatting that goes on. You design specifications, and you may have conversations that lead to that design decision that you make. But once you make that, you don't want that to be one moment in a conversation that was way up here. You got to tell your coding agent to scroll back and remember what I said back then. You want to actually have tangible outputs. A spec that gets created through, whether it's a vibe session or just a peer programming session. Now I have this written document that evolves, and it would be so cool to be able to take that spec and be all right, here's a different model. Start fresh. We don't need to use the code. We have the spec.
Yeah.
And you write the same you can take the same spec, 6 different models, write the program. Maybe take the best one of each or whatever it is. Have something that you could start from, so you're actually building out an architecture.
Yeah, but I think even
that formalized
even further.
at all? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, it is.
Forward.
We now are starting to do more spec-driven development. We have .prd files that would be the description of the spec, and those kinds of things are starting to get checked into the code bases. But I think also there was a nugget in what you were talking about in terms of design decisions that are made throughout the process. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's not just the spec that you actually use.
Why?
Well, it's the conversation. If you think about you were having a conversation with your designer or another engineer on the team in terms of how something should work, maybe over time, the history of that conversation should actually be something that's persisted into the code base in some senses. So,
and hopefully in some summarized fashion.
Yeah.
So it's actually grokkable.
Yeah, exactly.
And I know there's some people that keep actual, I can't remember what it's called, a why document, but it's basically around their decisions, not the decision we made, but why we made the decision.
Right.
And so you can go back to that and be like, no, here's why there's this fence here. You know?
Exactly.
You see a fence, you're like, why is the fence there? It doesn't
Right.
need to be there. It's like, well, there was a reason, and none of us know why. It's lost to history.
Right.
But now you could go back to that chat or that context and at least link it somehow, whether it's summarized or linkable or whatever it is, to be like, here's our spec, and then this part of the spec here, why is it like that? Well, here's the why.
Yeah. Maybe in that world, developers don't have to write documentation.
Now you're selling me.
Oh my gosh. Or they write one. They write one, the initial spec.
That's right.
Yeah, I was thinking about that too.
All right, awesome. This has been
Yeah.
a blast.
Yeah, thanks
so
for
much
having me, guys.
sitting down with us, Amanda.
Very fun. Thank you.
All right.